The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. The moment the execution chamber lights snapped on, everything inside Greensville went silent. 10 men, each one scheduled to die before sunrise, stood at their doors, staring at the same thing. Reese Marlowe, the inmate with the serpent dagger tattoo across his neck, was being walked toward the chamber, and he was smiling. He shouldn't have been smiling. He shouldn't have said a word. But he looked straight at the other death row inmates and whispered, "It's time all of you learn the truth." Before the guards could react, every cell light on the row flickered twice. Once, twice. Then the entire block dropped into a dull red emergency glow. Alarms didn't ring. Officers didn't move. And the 10 men condemned to die all turned toward Reese at the same time, their faces pale with a fear the prison had never seen. Something was happening. Something planned. Something that made even the warden freeze. And it began on the same night the state of Virginia prepared to execute the 10 most notorious men it had ever held. Now the story has to rewind. Back to the beginning. Back to how these 10 men ended up on that block. And back to the chain of events that led to the most unsettling night in Virginia's death row history. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. Years before the execution chamber lights flickered and Reese Marlowe smiled at the sight of his own gurney, Greensville Correctional Center was a place where time moved differently. Days didn't pass. They dragged, pulling men with them like heavy chains. The death row unit sat at the farthest corner of the prison grounds, surrounded by thick concrete walls that swallowed sound and memory the same way the state swallowed hope. When Reese arrived at the row, he stepped off the escort line with a strange calmness, as if he'd walked through those same gates before. The officers noticed it immediately. Most new inmates looked confused, angry, or scared. Reese looked curious. He kept turning his head slowly, studying the hall, the lights, the doors, the faces behind the bars. The serpent and dagger tattoo across his neck was the first thing everyone noticed, thick, dark, curling toward his jaw. But his eyes were what bothered people. They didn't match the rest of him. They were too steady, too aware. He took in his surroundings with a quiet confidence that spread through the tier like cold air. Men who had spent decades inside cages lifted their heads to watch him. Some leaned forward. A few stepped back. The one who reacted first was Derek "Hawk" Lanton. Hawk had ruled the row for years, not with violence, but with presence. His tattoo of a hawk stretched across his chest, its wings reaching up toward his shoulders. He was a tall, sharp-featured man whose voice rarely rose above a whisper, but that whisper could stop a fight 2 cells away. When Reese approached, Hawk gripped the bars and stared at him without blinking. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured. No threat, no challenge, just certainty. Reese didn't slow down. That's what makes it interesting. No one spoke to Hawk like that. A few inmates stepped closer to their doors, watching for what would happen next. The guards paused too, pretending they were checking paperwork, but really they were just waiting to see if Hawk would explode. He didn't. He stepped back, and that terrified the other inmates more than a fight ever could. Reese entered his cell, placed his small stack of property on the bunk, and stared through the window's slit at the dim hallway. Across from him, Marcus Trent sat quietly on his bed, writing another letter that no one would ever receive. Marcus wrote every day, always with the same slow, shaky hand. The burning clock tattoo on his arm pulsed whenever he tightened his muscles. He didn't look up at Reese, but he listened. Farther down was Colton Briggs, tall and pale, always leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. His black cross tattoo seemed to darken under the dim row light. Colton rarely spoke to anyone, but his silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. Miguel Renteria, with faded tattoos along his forearms, watched through half-lidded eyes. His stare didn't show hatred or fear, it showed calculation. Miguel treated every new inmate like a problem to solve. Then there was Benny Stitch Harrow, smaller than the rest, with tattoos that looked carved, not inked. Stitch had survived his early years in prison by refusing to sleep more than an hour at a time. He didn't trust darkness, or dreams, or men who moved like Reese. At the end of the row sat Jalen Price, the only man who made music in a place built to kill silence. He hummed quietly every night, a soft tune that drifted across the tier like a memory refusing to die. 10 men in total. 10 different paths. 10 different crimes. 10 execution dates waiting to be assigned. At first, Reese lived like a ghost in the block. He never started conversations, but he finished them. He corrected details, names, events, old stories the inmates had told only once, years ago, to people who were no longer alive. Sometimes he finished a sentence for someone. Sometimes he answered a question no one had asked out loud. Inmates exchanged looks in the dark. Guards whispered during shift changes. Something about Reese felt wrong. Something about him felt prepared. One afternoon, during a routine shakedown, guards caught Reese staring at the far end of the row, where a small maintenance panel stood bolted to the wall. He wasn't looking with curiosity. He was looking the way someone looks at a familiar place. Hawk noticed. Later that night, when the prison settled into its slow breathing and the last officer walked past the cells, Hawk leaned forward, speaking low through the bars. "Where did you hear that story about Miguel?" he asked. Reese didn't lift his head from his bunk. "You already know." "That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters." A cold silence spread between them. As the months passed, Virginia resumed its execution schedule after a long pause. One by one, letters from the Commonwealth arrived. Small envelopes. No fanfare. No warning. Each one contained a date, nothing more. When the 10th envelope arrived, the entire row felt the shift. 10 men. 10 dates. 6 months apart. One after another. Some inmates stared at the ceiling. Others sat with their heads in their hands. But Reese remained on his bunk, tapping his finger lightly, counting something only he understood. That night, when the lights dimmed and the guards walked away, he said softly, almost like a lullaby, 10 paths. 1 finish line. Stitch sat up instantly. "So you weren't lying." Hawk turned slowly, his expression grim. The others pretended not to listen, but every ear on the row strained for more. Reese didn't continue. He lay down, folded his hands behind his head, and stared at the ceiling as if waiting for something. From that moment on, the row changed. Men who never spoke began exchanging glances. Quiet signals moved from cell to cell. A folded paper slipped under a door. A rhythm knocked into concrete. A cough. A pause. A pattern. The guards noticed, but couldn't prove anything. By the time the first execution date arrived, the tension in the unit felt like a pressure cooker waiting to burst. Officers walked slower. Inmates watched more carefully. Even the air felt heavy, thick with whatever the 10 men weren't saying. 2 nights before the first execution, a storm rolled across the Virginia sky, rattling the windows so hard the row vibrated. Rain hammered the roof. Thunder shook the vents. But the inmates didn't move. All of them, every man on that row, sat still, listening. Reese stood at his door, calm as ever, watching the lights flicker with each distant strike. Hawk whispered to him through the bars, "Whatever you think this is, it won't work." Reese didn't respond immediately. When he finally turned, his eyes were clear, steady. "It already has." The storm outside roared again. Inside, the men remained silent. Nothing more happened that night. Not until the next. The night where the hook begins. The night when the power flickered twice. The night Reese smiled at the gurney. The night one of the cells opened on its own. And the night everything changed. The cell that stood open should have been impossible. Every death row door in Greensville locked with a steel bolt the size of a child's wrist, controlled by a panel only officers could access. Inmates couldn't slip a latch or jam a hinge. They couldn't pry, twist, or bend anything. But that night, when the emergency lights cast the row in a soft red glow, one door hung slightly ajar, as if someone had nudged it with a fingertip. The guards froze at the sight. Their radios crackled as voices stumbled over each other, trying to understand how the impossible had just happened. Officers shouted instructions. Someone called for an immediate lockdown. But before anyone could move to secure the door, a sound echoed from inside the empty cell. A slow tap. One tap. A pause. Then 2 more. The rhythm moved along the concrete, faint but deliberate, like someone dragging their fingers across the floor. The guards pointed their flashlights into the cell, expecting to see a body, a blanket, a shadow, anything. But the bunk was untouched, the the sheets in place, the tiny desk neat, the metal toilet still. No belongings disturbed. No marks. No movement. The inmate assigned to that cell, Colton Briggs, was gone. The men inside their cells leaned forward against their bars, hardly breathing. No one spoke. Even the ones who usually muttered in the dark stayed silent. Through the dim light, Reese Marlowe watched calmly, hands clasped behind him, his serpentine dagger tattoo catching a faint glint of red. The guards ordered everyone to step back from their doors. Metal clanged as boots rushed down the hallway. The tier filled with the sound of keys, commands, footsteps, and the uncertain tremble that officers tried but failed to hide. Hawk watched the chaos from his cell, then turned toward Reese. "You did this," he whispered. Reese didn't look at him. Not yet. Officers swept the tier, checking doors, shining lights, shouting questions. They repeated Colton's name over and over, as if he might answer from some dark corner. But the row was too empty, too contained, too heavily built for anyone to disappear. Then the power flickered again. Not a full blackout this time, just a tremor in the lights, a wink of brightness followed by a deeper shade of red. The hum of the electrical system shifted for a second, then steadied. But the flicker sent a chill across the row. Reese lifted his head slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. The warden himself arrived minutes later, his coat thrown over his shirt, his hair damp from running through the rain. He surveyed the corridor, barking questions at officers, ordering extra restraints, demanding an immediate search of the block. But the moment he stepped near Reese's cell, the chanting began again. It wasn't loud. It wasn't coordinated. But it was enough to stop every officer in their tracks. Jalen hummed the same quiet tune he always did, but now it blended with the low murmur Stitch mumbled under his breath. Miguel tapped a slow cadence against the wall. Marcus whispered something that sounded like a prayer, but his eyes remained open, fixed on the ceiling. And Hawk didn't chant at all. He just watched each of them, wide-eyed, realizing whatever Reese had set in motion wasn't just about an escape. It was about timing. The warden ordered the chanting to stop. The row went quiet, but the silence felt thinner now, as if something pressed against it from the other side. Reese finally spoke, not loudly, not with emotion, just enough for the nearest inmates to hear. "One down," he said. 9 to go. A guard slammed his baton against the bars. "Shut up." Reese looked at him with calm eyes. "You'll want to save that anger for later." The officers tightened their formation, preparing to extract Reese from his cell. But the warden raised a hand. "Not him," he said. "Search the block first. Find Briggs." The search began. Guards moved methodically, opening food slots, checking each cell, scanning corners and vents. Dogs were brought in, sniffing every inch of the walkway. Officers checked pipes, ducts, the narrow space between the ceiling panels and steel beams. Nothing. Not a sign. No marks, no prints, no moved objects. Colton Briggs had vanished as if he had never existed. Hawk stepped closer to his bars, watching the search unfold with tension digging into his jaw. His tattooed chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. "You think any of this ends well?" Hawk murmured toward Reese. "You think disappearing into the dark changes what's coming for you?" Reese turned his head slightly. "It changes everything. You're playing a game with men who already lost theirs," Hawk continued. "Whatever you started, stop it." Reese's smile was small but unmistakable. "It can't be stopped anymore." For hours, chaos rippled through the unit. Officers paced, shouted, argued, called supervisors. The prison lockdown expanded to other wings. Inmates in nearby units banged on their doors, sensing something was happening. Radios buzzed nonstop. But inside death row, the air felt colder, like the building itself was waiting. At nearly 3 in the morning, after the last sweep turned up nothing, the warden ordered all lights raised to full brightness. The red glow snapped into harsh white, washing the faces of every condemned man. Some squinted. Others stared back defiantly. Reese kept his eyes open the whole time, unbothered. The warden stepped in front of his cell. "You're going first," he said quietly. "Not on your scheduled date. Tonight." Reese blinked once. "Good." The warden's jaw tensed. "You think this is some kind of message? Some kind of show?" Reese stepped forward until his shadow merged with the bars. The serpent tattoo on his neck stretched slightly as he lifted his chin. "The message isn't for you," he said. "And the show hasn't started." Officers rushed in to move him, But before they could, a sharp metallic snap echoed through the row. Every head turned. The sound didn't come from the open cell this time. It came from the opposite end. A second cell door had unlocked. Just as impossible as the first. Just as silent. Just as deliberate. The inmate inside, Miguel Renteria, stood perfectly still, hands at his sides, staring at the open space between him and the hallway. His faded tattoos seemed to darken under the bright lights. Guards shouted, pulling weapons, forming a line. But Miguel didn't move. He simply spoke one slow sentence that chilled everyone who heard it. He's keeping his promise. Reese exhaled softly, almost satisfied. "Two," he murmured. And as the officers reached for Miguel, every light in the entire block went out. Darkness swallowed death row whole. That's where Chapter 3 begins. The shout hit the block like a shockwave. One single cry, sharp, panicked, and out of place, echoed through the long concrete hallway and ricocheted off the steel bars. Every inmate froze where they were. Even the ventilation hum seemed to hold its breath. Down the tier, officers rushed in with batons and radios bouncing at their sides. Their boots slammed against the metal walkway, the sound rolling across death row like thunder. Nobody talked. Nobody moved. Everyone just waited, eyes locked on the far cell where the noise came from. It came from Calvin Ricks, the inmate with the full-sleeve tattoo of a burning city running down his left arm. Calvin had spent weeks whispering about strange noises at night. Footsteps he swore he heard outside his door. A guard he claimed was watching him too closely. Most inmates ignored him. Some laughed, but none of them were laughing now. The officers unlocked Calvin's door and went inside. His voice carried out again, fast, shaky, terrified. "They said it's tonight. I heard them. They said it's tonight." Nobody understood what he meant. Tonight what? A fight? A transfer? An execution? Nothing on death row happened tonight. Everything was scheduled. Everything was controlled. They escorted Calvin out, his hands trembling so hard the tattoos on his knuckles blurred. He kept repeating the same thing over and over, staring straight ahead. "They're coming for me. They're coming for me." He didn't say who they were. That made it worse. As the officers pulled him down the tier, every inmate watched him pass. Gordon Hale, whose chest carried a tattoo of a cross made from barbed wire, leaned closer to his bars. Gordon didn't say a word. His eyes just followed Calvin, trying to make sense of the panic. Raymond Dole, with the lightning bolt tattoo across his scalp, exhaled slowly. He had seen men panic before, but not like this. Not shaking, not sweating, not talking about unseen things in the dark. When Calvin disappeared past the corner, the road didn't return to normal. A cold, heavy silence settled over the block. Officers lingered on the walkway longer than usual, checking each cell twice, maybe 3 times. Something had rattled them too. Hours passed, but at around 11 p.m., something unusual happened, something the inmates weren't used to seeing. 2 high-ranking administrators walked onto the tier. A captain followed them. Their shoes were polished, their faces tight, their voices low. Administrators didn't walk into death row this late. Not unless something important was going on. They stopped at the cell belonging to Elias Ward, the older inmate with the faded navy blue anchor tattoo on his wrist from a job he used to have on the docks before life went sideways. Elias stood up slowly from his bunk as the men approached. The administrators didn't raise their voices. They didn't bark commands. One simply said, "Ward, you need to come with us." The entire tier tensed. This was not standard procedure. Not at this hour. Not unannounced. The electronic lock buzzed, the door slid back, and Elias stepped out quietly. His face didn't show fear, but there was a stiffness in the way he held his shoulders, a man bracing for something he couldn't see. They walked him down the corridor and disappeared around the corner. Death row had never been so silent. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2. Inmates whispered theories through the bars. Did they move his date? What did Calvin hear? Why tonight? Nobody had answers, only questions floating in the dim light. Then, close to 2 in the morning, Elias returned. The officers walking him back looked serious, their eyes fixed forward. Elias stepped into his cell, the door buzzing shut behind him. The moment it clicked, the entire tier leaned toward their bars. Raymond was the first to ask, voice low but steady. "What did they tell you?" Elias sat down on the edge of his bunk and rubbed his hand over his face. The anchor tattoo on his wrist flexed with the movement. He didn't speak at first. He just stared at the floor, breathing slowly. Then he said it. They moved my execution date. Raymond blinked hard. Moved it how? Elias shook his head. Up. Gordon stepped closer to his bars. How far? Elias lifted his eyes, and the tired look in them said everything before the words even came out. 48 hours. The row erupted. Not loudly, not violently, just a ripple of disbelief and panic. Execution dates didn't move with 2 days' notice. Not in Virginia. Not anywhere. Raymond whispered, "That's not normal." Gordon whispered, "That's not legal." Another voice added, "Something's happening behind the scenes." Elias leaned back against the wall, running a hand through his graying hair. But the scariest part wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't say. Because while he was being escorted back, one of the guards had slipped something under his breath, too soft for the administrators to hear, but loud enough for Elias to catch it. A single sentence. A warning. A clue. One that tied directly to Calvin's panic and made Elias' blood run cold. But Elias didn't tell the others. Not yet. Because if that whisper was true, death row was about to turn into something none of them had ever seen before. And the clock was already ticking. The rest of the night felt heavier than any the row had seen in years. The dim lights along the ceiling flickered every few minutes, throwing shadows that stretched across the cells like long fingers. Nobody slept. Nobody even pretended to. Elias lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, replaying the guard's whisper over and over in his mind. He could still feel the warmth of the officer's breath near his ear, the way the man didn't look at him, didn't slow his steps, just delivered that low warning like someone passing a secret message in a crowded room. They're clearing space. That's what the guard had said. Not prepare yourself. Not good luck. Not it's time. They're clearing space. Those words carried a meaning Elias didn't want to explain to the others, not until he understood the full picture. Because clearing space didn't only mean moving one execution. It meant more were coming. He turned onto his side, staring through the bars at the walkway. Across the tier, Gordon was awake too, sitting on the floor with his back against his bunk, one knee pulled up. His barbed wire cross tattoo glowed faintly under the lights. He glanced toward Elias and gave a small nod. One of those silent gestures that said, "I'm awake. I heard everything. And I'm thinking about it too." Next door, Raymond paced his tight cell. The lightning bolt tattoo on his scalp glistened with sweat. He kept muttering to himself, not quite loud enough for the others to understand. Something about timing, about dates, about paperwork. Raymond wasn't afraid of dying, but he was terrified of the unknown. And tonight was filled with too much of it. Sometime around dawn, the soft bell that signaled morning shift change echoed down the hall. Normally, that sound brought a strange comfort. New guards, new eyes, new energy. But today, it only deepened the unease. 3 officers stepped onto the tier. They weren't the regular morning crew. These men walked differently. Faster, tighter, like they were late for a briefing nobody wanted to attend. They checked every cell, one by one, not saying much. Their belts looked heavier. Their radios buzzed nonstop. When they reached Elias' cell, one of them paused and looked inside longer than necessary. He wasn't angry. He wasn't intimidating. He just looked apologetic. Elias noticed it immediately. Apologies from guards were never good signs. Breakfast came late. The trays rattled as they slid through the slots. Eggs, toast, a cup of juice. But most inmates barely touched it. Nobody wanted to eat. The weight in the air felt too thick. Around mid-morning, the row finally broke its silence. Gordon called out first, his voice steady but low. "Ward, you didn't tell us everything. What did they say in that room?" Elias sat up on his bunk, but didn't move closer to the door. "You already know the important part." Raymond snapped from the next cell, "Don't play smart. Nobody moves a date up 2 weeks unless something big is happening. We don't want surprises. Just tell us." Elias inhaled slowly. He didn't want to lie. He didn't want to tell the truth either. He chose the middle ground. "There's movement scheduled. That's all." Raymond slammed his palm into the bars. "Movement? What does that mean?" Before Elias could answer, the officers at the far end of the tier began setting up a portable table and 2 clipboards. Nobody used a portable table on death row. Everything was done from the central office. Seeing that small folding piece of metal unfold on the walkway sent a quiet panic down the block. The captain appeared minutes later, carrying a folder tucked under his arm. He didn't make eye contact with any of the inmates. He stepped behind the little table and opened the folder. The officers around him straightened, like they knew what announcement was coming and hated being part of it. Then the captain cleared his throat and spoke. This morning, we will be confirming updated status notices with multiple inmates. When your name is called, step to the front of your cell and stand still. The first name he read hit the row like a punch. Elias Ward. Elias blinked hard. Gordon stood up. Raymond's pacing stopped immediately. Elias stepped to the bars. The captain didn't raise his eyes. He read from the paper. You are scheduled for transfer to the Greensville facility in 36 hours for final preparations. 36, not 48. They had moved him again. The row erupted. Voices rose, metal clanged, questions flew. The guards shouted for order, but the fear drowned out their commands. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't a clerical update. Someone was fast-tracking executions. And not just Elias. Because the captain wasn't finished. He flipped to the next page and read another name. Raymond Dole. Raymond froze, staring straight ahead. His lightning bolt tattoo seemed to fade under his sudden sweat. The captain continued. You are now on standby for advance notice pending review. Standby. Advance notice. Death row inmates knew what that meant. Raymond stepped back from the bars, gripping the sink behind him. His breath turned shaky. His mind raced so fast he looked dizzy. His execution wasn't scheduled soon, but now it could be moved at any moment. And he wasn't the only one. The captain flipped the page again. Gordon Hale. Gordon lifted his chin slowly, the barbed wire cross on his chest rising with each breath. The captain's voice didn't change tone, but his eyes flicked upward, like he wished someone else was reading this. You will receive a revised date within 72 hours. The entire row went silent. 3 men. 3 changes. All at once. Behind the captain, one of the younger officers shifted nervously. His hands trembled when he picked up a pen. He kept glancing down the walkway like someone was watching him. Elias saw it. Gordon saw it. Raymond definitely saw it. The officers were scared too. When the captain closed the folder, he said, Remain calm. Follow instructions. Further notices will come directly from administration. Then they left. The table stayed behind. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. It spread through the block like a cold fog, settling into every cell, every corner, every breath. Raymond grabbed the bars and hissed toward Elias. Tell us the truth. Now. Elias rubbed the anchor tattoo on his wrist, thinking. Then, quietly, he finally gave them the part he'd been holding back. When they pulled me aside last night, he said, one of the guards whispered something to me on the way back. Raymond leaned in. Gordon watched without blinking. Elias swallowed. He said this isn't about us at all. The row froze. It's about who's coming next. And before anyone could ask who that was, the heavy steel door at the far end of the tier clicked open. Footsteps entered. Slow. Deliberate. Too calm for what the row had just heard. Someone new was being brought in. And the entire block knew. Whoever this man was. He was the reason everything was changing. The footsteps grew closer, steady and heavy, echoing along the tier in a slow rhythm that made every inmate straighten instinctively. New inmates were rare on death row. New arrivals at odd hours were even rarer. Whatever was happening tonight wasn't normal protocol. The officers appeared first. 3 of them. Their posture was different from the morning shift, more cautious, more on guard. Behind them walked a man whose wrists were chained to a thick black belt around his waist. He wasn't tall, but there was a weight to his presence that pulled every eye in the block toward him. His head was shaved clean, and a tattoo of a broken hourglass stretched across the left side of his neck. He didn't look shaken. He didn't look confused. He walked like he already knew where he was going. Raymond stepped closer to his bars. Who's that? No one answered him. The officers guided the new man all the way to the far end of the tier, toward the single empty cell the row had almost forgotten existed. It hadn't been used in years. Some inmates said it was a cool-down cell. Others said it was for temporary overflow. But tonight, it felt like it had been waiting for someone specific. The officers unlocked the gate and guided the man inside. He didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He simply turned once, scanning the entire row with calm, focused eyes, like he was assessing the room. When his gaze swept past Raymond, Raymond flinched. When it passed Elias's breath caught for a moment. But when those eyes landed on Gordon, they stopped, just for a second longer than all the others. Then the door clanged shut. The officers removed the restraints, secured the lock, and walked away without saying a word. The man sat on the lower bunk, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. His hourglass tattoo shifted with every breath. And then, in a tone so calm it chilled the row more than shouting ever could, he spoke 3 words that changed everything. Things moved fast. Elias felt a cold pressure behind his ribs. That was the same phrase the guard had whispered to him in the hallway. That wasn't a coincidence. Not anymore. Raymond leaned in. Why'd they move our dates? What's going on? The man didn't look up. He just traced a line on the floor with the toe of his shoe. Transfers start tonight, he said. Gordon spoke next. Transfers for who? The new man finally lifted his head. His eyes were dark but strangely calm. He pointed to the row slowly, one inmate at a time. Raymond, Gordon, Elias, and then tapped his chest. Us. The row went silent. Not one inmate moved. He continued. There's a new schedule. Quiet. Off the books. They want the row cleared for incoming cases. Big ones. Political ones. High-profile ones. He tapped the hourglass tattoo lightly. When the sand runs out for us, they move in the next set. Raymond gripped his bars until his knuckles whitened. Who told you this? The man leaned back, folding his arms. I used to work intake. Before I became a number like everyone else. That explained his calm. His confidence. His eerie awareness of things no inmate should know. Gordon let out a slow breath. So that's why they're changing our dates. The man nodded once. Elias wiped his palms on his jumpsuit. How fast are we talking? The man lifted 2 fingers. Days. Raymond pressed his forehead against the bars. So they moved us up because they already know who's coming. The new inmate nodded again. 10 of them. High security. They want the row empty by the time they arrive. A sinking pressure settled over the tier. It wasn't the fear of death. It wasn't even the execution itself. It was the realization that none of them had control over the timeline anymore. The gears were already turning somewhere deep in the administration building. Papers already signed. Dates updated. Schedules printed. All behind closed doors. The man stood and stepped closer to his door, resting one hand on the cold metal. His voice softened. There's no use fighting the clock. But at least now you know why it's ticking. For a long moment, the entire row remained still, absorbing the truth piece by piece. Raymond sank onto his bunk. Gordon leaned against the bars. Elias closed his eyes and let the sound of the ventilation fill the silence. The officers returned a short while later, walking the tier with clipboards and sealed envelopes. Final notices. Adjusted schedules. Confirmations of transfer times. The sound of their footsteps was the only thing that broke the quiet. And by the time they left, every man on the row knew his countdown had officially begun. The lights dimmed for the night cycle. The ventilation hummed steady. The block settled into a cold stillness. But for the first time since the row opened, every inmate understood the same truth. Death row wasn't quiet tonight because the prison was calm. It was quiet because everything was already moving, and none of them could stop it. The tier stayed silent for hours, each man lying in the darkness with only the sound of his own heartbeat keeping time. Tomorrow would bring new changes, new whispers, new movements they couldn't predict. And when the officers returned at sunrise, carrying lists none of them had seen before, the row would begin shifting toward an ending each inmate had feared, but never expected to face so soon. Because in Virginia's most secretive corner of the justice system, the clock never stopped. And when it finally reached 0, the world outside would never hear the full story of what happened in that dim hallway, on that long steel tier, in those quiet final hours. But the men living it, they knew. And now you do too. If you want the next episode, the next case, or the next untold story from behind the concrete walls of America's most guarded facilities, stay tuned. There's always another secret waiting on the other side of the bars. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.